welcome back to Culture and Behavior in Architecture. I'm Professor Brandon Rowe, and today's lecture we're going to be diving into the specifics of culture, really understanding how people and places influence each other and how they interact with one another. So let's get started. So in our last lecture, we discussed the relationship between the objective built conditions of architecture and the subjective nature of human experience. Now, when we explore culture in architecture, we learn that there's a dynamic, symbiotic relationship between people and buildings. In other words, architecture can definitely affect the belief systems, the socio-cultural values, the meaning people attribute to the built environment. Now, on the other hand, the cultural beliefs, traditions, and behavioral patterns of societies can also directly affect a building's appearance, its aesthetics, or its spatial layout. So culture, the relationship between culture and architecture can go both ways. Now let's consider this quote by Juhani Palasma. He says, "The timeless task of architecture is to create embodied and lived existential metaphors that concretize and structure our being in the world. Architecture reflects, materializes, and eternalizes ideas and images of ideal life. Buildings and towns enable us to structure, understand, and remember the shapeless flow of reality, and ultimately to recognize and remember who we are." He goes on and continues, "Architecture enables us to perceive and understand the dialectics of permanence and change, to settle ourselves in the world, and to place ourselves in the continuum of culture and time. In its way of representing and structuring action and power, societal and cultural order, interaction and separation, identity and memory, architecture," he concludes, "is engaged with fundamental existential questions." Now, this is an important quote to consider as we go forward with our discussion about culture and its relationship to architecture. So you might think of architecture, culture, and behavior as these three different entities. In a way, architecture and culture, when they come together, we have place. When architecture affects behavior, we get a certain type of experience. And when culture and behavior come together, we derive meaning. And so architecture, culture, and behavior, this relationship, we're going to talk a lot about places, meaning, and experiences. So before we dive into these arguments, let's define a couple of terms. The first is, what is culture? Most definitions describe culture as the values, the symbols, the behaviors, beliefs, customs, and the traditions of a racial, religious, or social group. These are manifest in language. They're also manifest in cuisine, specifically dance, music, art, and especially in architecture. So culture, according to the late Roman Catholic liturgical scholar Kevin Seesoltz, he writes that culture has been defined in various ways, but it is basically a set of meanings and values informing a common way of life. He goes on, "It is a coherent system of meanings embodied in images and other symbols that enable people to relate cognitively, emotionally, and behaviorally to the world and to communicate that appreciation and understanding to others. It is a prism through which communities and individuals view the whole of their experience, domestic, political, social, and economic. Ultimately, this sense of culture, he argues, is preserved and transmitted by institutions. And we'll talk a little bit more about institutions, but an institution would be a religion, sometimes a government, social groups, etc. So let's look at kind of this relationship between culture and the study of anthropology. And what is anthropology? So broadly speaking, anthropology is the scientific study of humanity. It's concerned with our human behavior, with human biology, and societies. Now, there's four major fields of anthropology. We have cultural anthropology, which really seeks to identify meanings, norms, values for living cultures and societies. Right, so a cultural anthropologist would go and study a group of people to understand more about meanings, the norms and values that they associate to life. Archaeology, on the other hand, interprets the historical significance and cultural meaning of remnants of the material world. Art, artifacts, texts, architecture, all of this falls under the purview of archaeology. Third, we have linguistic anthropology. This is the study of language, its structure, evolution, its sociocultural context, etc. Lastly, we have physical anthropology. This is the study of human evolution and variation for the past as well as the present. Now, there's a couple of key definitions of culture that we should be aware of. Edward Tyler defined culture as that complex whole which includes knowledge, belief, art, law, morals, custom, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by man as a member of society. That was in 1871. A more recent definition in 1948 by Melville Herkowitz says that culture is the man-made part of the environment. Okay, so it's the product of what we make. Margaret Mead, on the other hand, in 1953 said culture is the total shared learned behavior of a society or a subgroup. Bronislaw Malinowski says that culture is a well-organized unity divided into two fundamental aspects, a body of artifacts and a system of customs. And lastly, Clifford Geertz defines culture as this historically transmitted pattern of meanings that are primarily embodied in symbols. He goes on, this is a system of inherited conceptions expressed in symbolic forms by means of which men communicate, perpetuate, and develop their knowledge about and attitudes towards life. So here's several definitions from the anthropological side of things on how we might view culture. What is it? Right? It's that man-made part of the environment. It could be this learned behavior. It's a body of artifacts and customs. It's a pattern of meanings as found in symbols, etc. So from an anthropological perspective, one thing that's important to understand is a myth. You know, a myth are what we call sacred narratives. They're often preserved in a ritual, drama, or ceremony. It usually answers existential questions about the origins of the cosmos. As such, myths are living things. They're not something just ancient of the past. They're the shared stories of who we are. It is only through the storytellers that we can retain the interconnectedness of the human spirit. So we cannot forget the old ways. So if we think about stories, myths, these narratives, right, and then we apply this to architecture, Juhani Palasma argues that tradition is an astounding sedimentation of images and experiences, and it cannot be invented. It can only be lived. It constitutes an endless excavation of layered, internalized, and shared myths, memories, images, and experiences. Tradition is the site of the archaeology of emotions, he goes on. An artistic image, which does not derive this from mental soil, is doomed to remain a mere rootless fabrication, a quotation from the Encyclopedia of Formal Inventions, and destined to wither away without being able to refertilize the soil and continuum of a renewed tradition, and thus become itself part of it. So one of the videos that the students were assigned to watch this week was a talk by Wade Davis. Wade Davis wrote a book and coined the term ethnosphere. He defines an ethnosphere as the sum total of all thoughts, dreams, myths, and memories brought into being by the human imagination from the dawn of consciousness. Now, there's a couple of key terms that we're going to learn about related to ethnosphere, but this is an important concept to remember. Now, there are some related terms. One is ethos. Ethos is really the moral and aesthetic aspect of culture, according to Clifford Geertz. Right? This is the spirit of a culture. It's its distinguishing character, its tone, its sentiment, moral nature, guiding beliefs. It's the attitude of a person, a group, an institution, or society. That is the ethos. A worldview, on the other hand, is this cognitive, existential aspect of culture. It's a mental model of reality. In ways, it's what we believe about the world. It's a comprehensive conception or an apprehension from a specific standpoint. This is usually affected by our inherited characteristics, our background experiences, our education, life situations, values, attitudes, habits, etc. Now, we have another kind of similar definition by the geologist Carol Hill about worldview. Carol argues that by worldview, I mean the basic way of interpreting things and events that pervades a culture so thoroughly that it becomes a culture's concept of reality. What is good, what is important, what is sacred, what is real, all of this is worldview. Worldview is more than culture, even though the distinction between the two can sometimes be subtle. It extends to perceptions of time and space, of happiness and well-being. The beliefs, values, and behaviors of a culture stem directly from its worldview. So, as we talk about these various concepts and thinking about cultures, we want to ask the question, well, what changes a culture, right? We know what culture is, what makes it unique, but what really changes it? Kevin Seesoltz has a nice definition of what we might call cultural maintenance. You know, how do you maintain a culture in a specific society? He says that culture is mediated through institutions that have the task of sustaining and cultivating meaning and naming it so people can own it. More specifically, culture is mediated through both verbal and nonverbal symbols, including myths, rituals, stories, and metaphors. Unless the symbols are cultivated and sustained, social structures are apt to collapse. They enable the social system to produce and reproduce. Without them, he argues, chaos results because meaning becomes exclusively personal and privatized. So he goes on and describes what is involved with cultural change. So when he says, when cultural institutions interact with one another and try to relate and respond to historical changes in society, three things can happen. Number one, new symbols can be created. Two, old symbols can be preserved and protected from contamination. Or three, extant symbols can be transformed through a process of enculturation. And we're going to talk a little bit about this third one, enculturation, and other definitions related to this as culture undergoes transformations and changes. So there's a couple of key terms here that you should be aware of. One is ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism is a process by which a person applies their own culture, their ethnicity, right, as a frame of reference to judge other cultures, practices, behaviors, beliefs, and people. So for instance, I grew up part of my youth in Hawaii. Hawaii has a number of cultures, beliefs, foods, etc., music, lifestyle, all of the above, right? And as a teenager, my family moved to the state of California and Utah, right? So I would bring kind of this ethnicity, this culture that I was growing up with, these practices, behaviors, beliefs with me to this new location. And sometimes that can be kind of foreign. And so we have another term called acculturation. This is the process by which people assimilate to a different culture by adopting, acquiring, and adjusting to the prevailing cultural environment of a particular society. So if I was born in another country, let's say China, and I immigrated to the United States, right, I would be assimilating my own culture, my Chinese culture, and adopting, acquiring, adjusting to the American way of life, that particular culture. So that's a process what we call acculturation. Now, syncretism, on the other hand, is the process by which two or more belief systems are blended together to create a new system of belief. So a good example of this might be the Catholic observance of the Day of the Dead in Mexico. If you're at all familiar with the Day of the Dead, right, this was an earlier pre-Columbian observance, right? And as you know, the Spanish conquistadors came to Mexico, right, and brought Catholicism with them, right, there was this blending of two belief systems into one and creating this new observance, right? So that is syncretism. Now, we have here an example of John Barry's acculturation model. So a couple of things can happen, right? If someone moves to a new culture or these kind of things. So in this model, there's 4 different strategies. The first is assimilation. We talked a little bit about this, but this is where someone from a different culture would adopt the cultural norm of the country, the region that they have moved to. So they're accepting this host culture. On the other hand, integration is where people adopt both the dominant culture and their original culture. You can combine the two at the same time. So this we call integration. We're still accepting the host culture, but we're kind of blending the two. Third, we have separation. This is when someone completely rejects the dominant culture and keeps their culture of origin instead. Marginalization, on the other hand, is when someone rejects both their original culture and the cultural norm. So let's move on now to the aesthetic experience and the human spirit. Now, Sir Winston Churchill once said that we shape our buildings, thereafter they shape us. So the question we would ask ourselves is, does architecture really affect us? Can it shape us? Can it inspire us? Inspire the human spirit? Well, in Eastern traditions, there's this triad of the body, mind, and spirit, which are connected in many ways to our physical experience, our psyche, our psychological experience, and the culmination of really who we are, our self, or as some would say, our human spirit. Now, neuroscience is beginning to help us understand on deeper levels how aesthetic experience actually affects us. Similar, and so in a similar way, a recent study that was published in 2017 by Coburn and others, titled "Buildings, Beauty, and the Brain: A Neuroscience of Architectural Experience," kind of broke it down into three realms. We have cognition, behavior, and emotion. Now, similar to this triad of body, mind, and spirit, neuroscientists break down this experience, our aesthetic experience, into these three related categories. Cognition really tying into our knowledge, our meaning that we attribute to the built environment. Our behavior is more our sensory motor, right? Our body. Emotions has connections to a number of things, valuation. We'll talk later on in other lectures about these in more depth. Now, you've probably heard this arguments, nature versus nurture, right? And so if we think about it on a neuroscience perspective, nurture is really our culture, right? It's our sets of beliefs, the knowledge, meaning, our education, what affects us, our upbringing, our memories, our semantic associations, our context, intelligence, ourselves, our thought processes, etc. Nature, on the other hand, is the biological sense of the human being, right? So our behaviors, our emotions, right? These are more embedded within us, not necessarily as affected by the nurture component. So let's talk a little bit about culture and context. As we learn from anthropology, culture is both verbal and a non-verbal language. So when we look for culture in architecture, there's usually a unique spirit of the place, or genus loci, that can be found around the world in the various places that we might travel and venture to. It's most obvious when you're a foreigner going into a new place. There's usually this unique sense of place. When you've lived there your whole life, it's just a part of you, and so when you go to a foreign context, you notice the surroundings in a different way. So if we were to look at various significant cities around the world, let's say Paris, right? So here's some of the architecture of Paris. Can you get the sense of place in Paris here? Here's another example. Beijing, China. Here's some of their traditional architecture. Can you get a sense of place here? Now, we're not looking at some of the modern examples because we want to look at the older culture traditions. Now, what about the United States, the capital? Can you get a sense of place from these images in Washington, D.C., and some of the monuments, the buildings that shape American democracy? Now, let's consider Venice for a second. I'm going to read to you a quote by the philosopher Roger Scruton. He says, "Venice would be less beautiful without the great buildings that grace the waterfronts. Longhenna's Church of Santa Maria della Salute, the Ca d'Oro, the Ducal Palace, all of these are significant buildings. But these buildings are set among modest neighbors, which neither compete with nor spoil them. These are neighbors whose principal virtue resides precisely in their neighborliness, their refusal to draw attention to themselves or to claim the exalted status of high art." He goes on, "Ravishing beauties are less important in the aesthetics of architecture than things that fit appropriately together, creating a soothing and harmonious context, a continuous narrative as in a street or a square, where nothing stands out in particular and good manners prevail." So, in like manner, Juhani Palasma has this to say in regards to this contextual meaning of architecture. He says, "Architecture meaning is always contextual, relational, and temporal. Great works achieve their density and depth from the echo of the past, whereas the voice of the products of superficial novelty remains feeble, incomprehensible, and meaningless. The first responsibility of the architect is always to the inherited landscape or urban setting. A profound building has to enhance its wider context and give it new meanings and aesthetic qualities. Responsible architecture improves the landscape of its location and gives its lesser architectural neighbors new qualities instead of degrading them. It always enters a dialogue with existent conditions. Profound buildings are not self-centered monologues." So here we have kind of one philosopher, British philosopher, another architectural theoretician, philosopher Juhani Palasma from Finland, kind of echoing this same notion, right? Architectural meaning is always contextual, but the architect should pay attention to this inherited landscape or urban setting. Now, Yale professor of philosophy Karsten Harries, in his book The Ethical Function of Architecture, says architects need to be wary about losing a sense of place. He writes, "Just as human beings need to locate themselves in space, so they need to locate themselves in time, find their place in time. If there is to be genuine dwelling, we must be able to defeat the terror of time, to genuinely situate ourselves in time. That is, we must discover our home, not just in space, but in time. This architectural defense against the terror of time is especially necessary," he argues, "in a culture in danger of losing its sense of place." So, if we look at this image here, I'd like you to think about this quote by Juhani Palasma as we're looking at this blobitectural building that has been placed or landed, right, in a very historical context. Juhani says the task of architecture is not to shock, critique, amaze, or entertain, but to provide us with our foothold in the realm of the real, and thus lay the foundation for a critical position to culture and life. Now, Dmitry Porphyrios says that good architecture really should build off the past. So this quote in his book Classical Architecture, he says that any serious study of architecture and art in general soon shows that the real difference between the great and the lesser architect is that the former imitates the principles of a great heritage, unlike the latter, who copies the mannerisms of his predecessors or of his contemporaries. That is the true meaning of creativity and tradition. But if creativity is to be understood as production ex nihilo, or out of nothing, there would be no place for competence and intelligence. Even more, he goes on, there would be no place for meaning. So meaning, according to Dmitry Porphyrios, builds off of the past, right? It imitates the principles of a great heritage. We don't just create something out of nothing. Stephen Semmes, professor of architecture at Notre Dame, in his book, The Future of the Past, argues that good architects, when they're designing a building in a specific context, they need to do a couple of steps. Number one, the architect should define the boundaries and identify the character of this pre-existing context. The second is that they should determine the appropriate response to a context. Third, they should then evaluate the character of their proposed intervention. Now, how do you determine an appropriate response to the context then? After you've studied the context, he lists four possibilities, right? Number one is a generally good context would be improved upon by reinforcing its strengths and diminishing its weaknesses. The second approach would be a consistent and valuable context should be respected and reinforced. Third, if you have an unsuitable context or there really isn't much context, that it should be made suitable by your proposed intervention, your design proposal. And fourth, any response that would basically diminish a positive context should be unacceptable by architects. So here's an architectural comic by Leon Creer on how architects can deal with history, right? You have there on the left a final building in bad repair, right? This is the architect's dilemma. You could have no glory in basically doing the right thing. So you could faithfully restore it and gain oblivion. Or you can gain instant glory through scandalous rape and basically destroy the historical building and what was once there and have this contrasting new and old type of approach. Here's some examples. Now, how did these architects approach the context, approach the history? Were they respectful? Were they disrespectful? I'll let you be the judge of that. Now, here's another approach. The Dresden Church of Our Lady, which was built in 1743, this Baroque church stood for nearly 200 years, but it was bombed in 1945 during World War II. It was then faithfully restored with new and old materials. So the image on the right there, you can see some of the blackened masonry stones that were used, right? And so this blending together of new and old materials was, in a sense, a poetic statement, right? We're not to forget the past, but we can have an assurance that history, culture, and tradition will continue despite attempts to wipe it out. Now, Giovanni Palassima talks a little bit about this. He says, in a world which is increasingly fictionalized by an architecture of the commercialized image and the enticing and seducing architecture of the retinal image, the task of the critical, profound, and responsible architect is to create and defend the sense of the real. Instead of creating or supporting a world of fantasy, the task of architecture is to strengthen our experience of the real in the spheres of perception and experience, as well as in cultural and social interaction. He continues, when our settings are turning into thematized and fabricated facades of fictitious culture, or simulacra, to use a notion frequently used by Umberto Eco and other philosophers of post-modernity, the duty of responsible architecture is to defend the authenticity and autonomy of human experience. In the world of simulacra, simulation, and virtuality, on the other hand, the ethical task of architects is to provide the touchstone of the real. So, as you go into the workforce and all become architects, you must remember the importance and value of culture. Each of you has an ethical responsibility to the context, the people, the cultures, the inherited traditions that you will design for throughout your career. Do not forget Sir Winston Churchill's saying that we shape our buildings and thereafter they shape us. So we end with the question, what is culture and architecture? Culture and architecture is really understanding how people and places influence each other. And that's the end for our lecture today. Join us again next time. Our next topic will be discussing spirituality in architecture.